At 01:15 hours on June 6, 1944, Major Friedrich von der Heydte stood at the window of his command post near Carentan and listened to something that made his blood run cold. The sky above the Cotentin Peninsula was filled with the drone of aircraft engines. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The sound came from everywhere at once, a low mechanical thunder that seemed to swallow the night itself. Von der Heydte was a veteran. He had jumped into Crete in 1941. He had fought in North Africa with the Ramke Brigade. He had seen combat on the Eastern Front. Nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. Within the next 3 hours, more than 13,000 American paratroopers would fall from that black sky. They would land in fields, in flooded marshes, on rooftops, in trees, and in the middle of German positions. They would arrive scattered, disorganized, many without their weapons. And they would terrify the Wehrmacht in ways that no military planner had anticipated. What von der Heydte did not know, what no German officer could have predicted, was that the very chaos of this airborne assault would become its greatest weapon. The Americans were not landing in neat formations. They were landing everywhere, and that single word, everywhere, would appear again and again in German reports, diaries, and interrogation transcripts over the following weeks. The German officers who survived Normandy would write about these paratroopers with something approaching awe. Some would write with fear. A few would write with the kind of grudging respect that soldiers reserve for enemies who have earned it. This is the story of how American paratroopers created a new kind of psychological warfare. Not through careful planning, but through courage, adaptability, and an aggressive spirit that caught the German military machine completely off guard. The German army in 1944 was arguably the most professional fighting force in the world. Its officer corps had been trained in a tradition stretching back to Frederick the Great. German doctrine emphasized careful planning, precise coordination, and the systematic application of overwhelming force at decisive points. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 27 days. France fell in 6 weeks. The German military machine had rolled across Europe with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. But there was a vulnerability hidden inside this very strength. German military thinking depended on understanding the enemy. It required knowing where the enemy was, what he intended to do, and how he would try to do it. German officers were trained to read the battlefield like a chess master reads a chessboard, anticipating moves, calculating responses, maintaining control. The American paratroopers who landed in Normandy shattered this approach entirely. Not because they were better trained, not because they had superior weapons, but because they did something the Germans could not comprehend. They fought effectively in complete chaos. The German military hierarchy on the night of June 5th was a study in organizational rigidity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, was not even in France. He had left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. He was convinced the weather was too poor for an Allied invasion. General-Lieutenant Wilhelm Fally, commander of the 91st Luftland Division, was on his way to Rennes for a war game. His division was specifically trained to counter airborne assaults. On the night when that training would have mattered most, Fally was driving through the Norman countryside in his staff car. At approximately 04:30 hours, Fally heard the aircraft overhead. He understood immediately what was happening. He ordered his driver to turn around and race back to his headquarters at Château de Bernaville, near Picauville. Fally never made it. A small group of American paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, had landed near the chateau. They had set up an ambush on the road leading to the headquarters. When Fally's staff car approached, the Americans opened fire. First Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, a 24-year-old officer from Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, shot and killed General Fally as he tried to escape the vehicle. Fally became the first German general to die in the Normandy invasion. He was killed within hours of the first parachute drops, before he could issue a single order, before he could organize any coherent response to the American assault. The impact of Fally's death rippled through the German command structure. The 91st Division, specifically positioned to counter airborne operations, was now leaderless at the most critical moment, and this was just one death among many. All across the Cotentin Peninsula, German officers were being killed, captured, or simply cut off from their units. The chain of command was disintegrating before the beach landings even began. The American airborne operation had been designed with specific objectives. The 82nd Airborne Division was supposed to capture the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and secure crossings over the Merderet River. The 101st Airborne Division was tasked with seizing the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and blocking German reinforcements from reaching the landing areas. These were clear, logical objectives, but the execution went badly wrong almost immediately. Cloud cover over the peninsula caused transport pilots to climb or dive to avoid collisions. German anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations further. Pilots, many flying combat missions for the first time, released their paratroopers early, late, or simply wherever they happened to be when the panic set in. The result was catastrophic dispersion. Paratroopers who were supposed to land together found themselves alone. Units that were supposed to assemble in specific locations were spread across hundreds of square miles of Norman countryside. The statistics were sobering. Of the 6,928 men of the 101st Airborne Division who jumped that night, only 1 in 6 landed in their designated drop zones. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne experienced the worst scatter, with only 25% of its men landing within a mile of their intended targets. After 24 hours of fighting, the 101st Airborne could account for only 2,500 of its 6,000 men under division control. The rest were scattered, captured, wounded, or dead. Private First Class Bob Nobles of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed in a farmer's field with no idea where he was. He could hear gunfire in every direction. He had lost most of his equipment during the jump. His first encounter with another American soldier came when someone emerged from the darkness screaming, "Do not shoot! Do not shoot! I am from Kokomo, Indiana. I forgot the password." Nobles laughed. In the middle of German-occupied France, surrounded by enemy soldiers, not knowing if he would survive the night, he laughed. This was the American paratrooper in microcosm, not a disciplined automaton executing a perfect plan. A human being, improvising, adapting, refusing to be paralyzed by fear or confusion. For the German defenders, this scattered nightmare was incomprehensible. German military doctrine assumed that an airborne assault would target specific objectives. Defenders were supposed to identify the drop zones, determine the enemy's intentions, and concentrate forces to crush the paratrooper landing before it could consolidate. But how do you concentrate forces against an enemy who is everywhere and nowhere? How do you identify drop zones when paratroopers are landing in every field, every marsh, every village for miles in every direction? The German response fragmented almost immediately. Local commanders had to deal with threats appearing in their immediate vicinity. They could not wait for orders from higher headquarters, because higher headquarters could not tell them what was happening. The telephone lines had been cut, runners were ambushed, the radio nets were jammed with confused and contradictory reports. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commander of the 709th Infantry Division, had been at the Rennes war game when the invasion began. He raced back to find his division in chaos. In his post-war account for the United States Army Historical Division, von Schlieben wrote that by June 7th, his regiment was no longer even able to capture Sainte-Mère-Église, much less hold it against the fire of enemy naval guns and tanks. He personally had to rally retreating troops to prevent what he called the beginning of a panic caused by enemy armor. The German General Staff had a term for this kind of situation. They called it Kriegsnebel, the fog of war. But this was fog, unlike anything they had experienced. It was not merely confusion about enemy movements. It was total uncertainty about the basic nature of the threat. Were these paratroopers the main assault or a diversion? Were there thousands of them or tens of thousands? Were they targeting Cherbourg or Carentan, or some objective that had not yet become apparent? In the absence of clear information, German commanders hesitated, and hesitation in war is often fatal. The 7th Army headquarters received its first reports of parachute landings at approximately 01:30 hours. General Friedrich Dollmann, the army commander, was in Rennes attending the war game that had drawn so many senior officers away from their posts. He did not return to his headquarters until after dawn. The timing of this war game was catastrophic for the German defense. Approximately half of all division commanders in the Cotentin Peninsula were away from their posts when the American paratroopers began landing. A quarter of all regimental commanders were similarly absent. The war game had been scheduled to test German responses to an Allied invasion. Instead, it ensured that the actual invasion would face a decapitated command structure. Von Schlieben later wrote that he had left for Rennes late in the afternoon of June 5th, together with the commander of the 739th Grenadier Regiment. When the invasion began, they were miles from their divisions, unable to issue orders, unable to coordinate responses, unable to do anything except race back through the Norman night, hoping to reach their commands before it was too late. In Dollmann's absence, the 7th Army Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, tried to make sense of the fragmentary reports flooding in. Paratroopers had been sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers had been reported south of Carentan. Paratroopers were supposedly landing near Montebourg, near Valognes, near dozens of other locations across the peninsula. Pemsel was convinced this was the real invasion. He telephoned General Gunther Blumentritt at OB West headquarters and insisted that Normandy was the main Allied effort. Blumentritt reported to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who dismissed the assessment. Normandy, von Rundstedt declared, was merely a diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais. This disagreement at the highest levels of German command paralyzed the response for critical hours. Pemsel was right. Von Rundstedt was wrong. But by the time the truth became undeniable, the Americans had already established their foothold. The dummy parachutists that the Allies had dropped added to the confusion. These were small mannequins, weighted and fitted with parachutes, designed to draw German attention away from the real drop zones. When they hit the ground, explosive charges simulated gunfire. German units wasted precious hours responding to these phantom threats. By the time Pemsel understood that the main American effort was concentrated on the eastern side of the Cotentin Peninsula, it was too late to mount an effective response. The paratroopers had already seized key positions. The beach landings had begun. The German defensive plan was in shambles. The failure of German command and control on D-Day was not simply a matter of bad luck. It was the result of a deliberate American strategy, though not entirely the strategy that had been planned. The planners who designed the airborne operation had intended for paratroopers to land in concentrated groups, seize specific objectives, and hold them until relieved by forces from the beaches. The scattered drops that actually occurred were considered a failure at the time, but the chaos served American purposes, even if it was not intended. The German military was organized to respond to identified threats in specific locations. When threats appeared everywhere simultaneously, the response mechanism broke down. First Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, landed in a field near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont at approximately 01:20 hours. Like most paratroopers that night, he found himself alone and disoriented. Winters was 26 years old, a farm boy from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had never been in combat before. The aircraft carrying his company commander and most of the company headquarters staff had been shot down. Every officer senior to Winters in Easy Company was either dead or missing. Within hours, Winters would lead one of the most celebrated small unit actions of the entire war. By dawn, Winters had gathered approximately a dozen men from various units. His battalion commander ordered him to deal with a German artillery battery that was firing on Utah Beach. The battery was located at a position called Brecourt Manor, about 300 meters from the American assembly point. Winters conducted a quick reconnaissance. He found 4 German 105mm howitzers, connected by a trench system and defended by approximately 60 soldiers with multiple machine gun positions. He had 12 men. Winters divided his small force into assault and support elements. He positioned machine guns to provide covering fire. He sent 3 men to flank the first gun position with grenades. Then he personally led the assault down the trench line. The attack was textbook in its execution, and the textbook was being written in real time. Winters and his men took the first gun, then the second, then the third. Reinforcements arrived from Dog Company under 2nd Lieutenant Ronald Spears. Together, they took the 4th gun. By the end of the assault, approximately 23 men had participated. The entire action lasted approximately 3 hours. Winters's group killed 15 German soldiers, wounded many more, and captured a map showing the positions of all German artillery in the Cotentin Peninsula. That map would prove invaluable to American forces. The suppression of the battery allowed troops landing at Utah Beach to move inland with far fewer casualties than they might otherwise have suffered. Winters was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross instead, due to a policy limiting Medal of Honor awards to 1 per division for the invasion. What made Brecourt Manor significant was not just its tactical success. It was the way Winters adapted to impossible circumstances. He had no heavy weapons, no air support, no numerical advantage. He had a handful of men, most of whom he had never worked with before, and he attacked anyway. This aggressive spirit appeared again and again across the Cotentin Peninsula on June 6th. Small groups of American paratroopers, cut off from their units and their leaders, did not go to ground and wait for rescue. They attacked. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment seized control before dawn. The town was the first in France to be liberated by American forces. The assault was not coordinated. It was not planned. It happened because individual soldiers saw an opportunity and took it. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a small group into the town center at approximately 0400 hours. His men had landed scattered throughout the surrounding area. Most had lost their equipment bundles. Some had only pistols and knives. They took the town anyway. German defenders were killed or captured before they could organize resistance. The swastika flag was pulled down from the town hall. An American flag, which one sergeant had carried folded inside his jump jacket, was raised in its place. This was not how invasions were supposed to work. An invasion required preparation, concentration of force, overwhelming firepower. Sainte-Mère-Église fell to a handful of men who acted before the enemy understood what was happening. Similar stories played out across the Norman countryside that night. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers, of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, led an assault on a series of German barracks buildings near the village of Messières. He had been ordered to clear the buildings with a small squad of 15 men. When most of his men hung back, Summers went forward with only Private William Burt providing machine gun cover and Private John Camion joining the assault. Summers kicked open the first door and killed everyone inside with his submachine gun. Then he moved to the next building, and the next. For 5 hours, Summers fought his way through the German position, building by building, room by room. By the time he finished, Summers had killed over 30 German soldiers. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Like Winters, He received a lesser decoration instead. The stories of individual heroism from D-Day could fill volumes. Each paratrooper who jumped that night has a story. Most of those stories will never be known. The men who could tell them are gone, and they took their memories with them. What survives is the cumulative record. And that record tells a consistent story of men who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. The German officer corps had been trained to expect rational behavior from their enemies. An outnumbered force should seek to preserve itself. A scattered force should attempt to consolidate before engaging. An isolated force should defend until relieved. The Americans did none of these things. Major Friedrich von der Heydter had his own encounter with American aggression beginning on June 6th. Von der Heydter commanded the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, one of the most elite units in the German army. His paratroopers were veterans of Crete, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They were among the best trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Von der Heydter had positioned his regiment to defend Carentan, a critical crossroads town that connected the American landing beaches at Utah and Omaha. Whoever controlled Carentan controlled the link between the two American beachheads. His regiment achieved a grim distinction that night. They were the first German unit to identify enemy soldiers landing in Normandy, specifically the pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division, who landed between Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Baupte, and Carentan. At 6 in the morning on June 6th, von der Heydter personally interrogated captured American pathfinders in Carentan. He was struck by their distinctive appearance. Many had shaved their heads into mohawk cuts and painted their faces for battle. Von der Heydter reportedly remarked to his staff, "Now they are sending us their Indians." The captured Americans told von der Heydter something that would prove prophetic. They claimed that German forces believed there were about 10 times as many people on the peninsula as there actually were. The scattered drops had created an illusion of overwhelming force. Von der Heydter expected the Americans to spend several days consolidating their scattered forces before attempting any major operations. The Americans attacked on June 10th, 4 days after the initial landings. The assault on Carentan became one of the most bitter battles of the entire Normandy campaign. American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division advanced along exposed causeways under withering German fire. They crossed flooded fields waist-deep in water. They fought house to house through the streets of the town. Von der Heydter later wrote about his opponents with evident respect. He noted their willingness to take casualties, their refusal to break under fire, their aggressive tactics even when outnumbered. His regiment earned a nickname from the Americans who fought them. They called them the Lions of Carentan. At one point during the battle, the Americans negotiated a 2-hour truce at noon on June 11th to collect their dead and wounded. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, used the opportunity to send a message to von der Heydter, demanding his surrender. Von der Heydter had received orders through Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to hold Carentan at all costs. He could not surrender even if he wanted to, but he was running out of ammunition. His regiment had taken severe casualties. The Americans kept coming. When Taylor's surrender demand arrived, Hauptmann Rolf Mager of the 2nd Battalion replied in English with a question of his own. Would you surrender in the same situation? The fighting around Carentan had already cost von der Heydter's regiment dearly. Hauptmann Emil Preikschat, commanding the 1st Battalion, had led attacks against the 101st Airborne at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. By the evening of June 7th, Preikschat's men were decimated, most of them wounded and unable to fight. They accepted an offer of surrender from Colonel Howard Johnson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Only 25 men escaped to reach Carentan. The elite German paratroopers were being destroyed by American paratroopers who had been in combat for less than 48 hours. On June 12th, von der Heydter ordered his surviving troops to withdraw from Carentan under cover of darkness. The fighting continued through a German counterattack on June 13th, before the town finally fell securely to the Americans on June 14th. The fall of Carentan linked the Utah and Omaha beachheads. The American position in Normandy was now secure, and von der Heydte's elite paratroopers had been pushed back by men who had been in combat for less than a week. The German 7th Army kept detailed records of the Normandy campaign. These records included after-action reports, intelligence summaries, and the personal observations of officers at all levels of command. These documents reveal a military organization struggling to understand an enemy that did not behave as expected. German intelligence officers compiled analyses of American tactics. They studied captured documents. They interrogated prisoners. They tried to find patterns that would allow them to predict American behavior. They largely failed. A German report dated June 20th, 1944, known as the von Rundstedt Report, number 505044, attempted to summarize what had happened. The document noted that only in the American bridgehead north of Carentan were the enemy airborne troops compressed in the direction of the coastal defense after tough fighting for days. The phrasing revealed the German frustration. They had expected to crush the paratroopers quickly. They had fought for days merely to contain them. The American paratroopers did not follow predictable patterns because they were not trying to follow patterns. They were trying to accomplish objectives. When one method did not work, they tried another. When conditions changed, they adapted. They were guided by goals rather than procedures. This goal-oriented approach was second nature to American soldiers. It was how they had been raised. American culture in the 1930s and 40s emphasized practical problem-solving. The men who became paratroopers had grown up tinkering with machines, improvising solutions, figuring things out for themselves. They brought this mentality to warfare, and it drove their German opponents to distraction. Certain themes appear repeatedly in German documents when discussing American paratroopers. The word aggressive appears constantly. German officers noted that American paratroopers attacked when any reasonable assessment suggested they should defend. They took risks that seemed foolhardy. They pressed forward despite casualties that would have caused other units to fall back. The word unpredictable appears almost as often. German intelligence officers complained that American paratrooper units did not behave according to rational military principles. They did not wait for their supply lines. They did not pause to consolidate. They did not seem to care that they were outnumbered or surrounded. Perhaps most significantly, the German reports noted the quality of American junior leadership. In the Wehrmacht, decisions flowed from the top down. Officers gave orders. Soldiers executed them. Initiative at the lower ranks was not encouraged. American paratroopers operated differently. When officers were killed or separated from their units, sergeants took command. When sergeants were unavailable, corporals stepped up. Even privates made tactical decisions that in the German army would have required approval from officers far above their pay grade. This decentralized approach confused German defenders. They could not decapitate American units by killing their officers, because the units kept fighting under whoever was left alive to lead them. Fallschirmjäger Erwin Schmieger served in the 9th Parachute Regiment during the Normandy campaign. In a post-war interview documented by military historian Gilberto Villahermosa, Schmieger recalled facing American troops near Hill 192, close to the town of St. Lo. Schmieger described his opponents as madmen. He specifically mentioned the Americans of the 2nd Infantry Division, whose soldiers wore the Indian head insignia on their shoulders. But his description could have applied to any of the American units fighting in Normandy that summer. Schmieger recalled one night in particular. German paratroopers were holding positions along the edge of a wood, each man in a foxhole about 50 meters apart. They could hear Americans moving in the darkness. There was no shooting, no artillery, just the sound of men creeping through the underbrush. Then Schmieger heard a scream, A German soldier in a nearby foxhole had been killed silently, his throat cut. Schmieger spent the rest of the night in his foxhole, trembling with fear, unable to see his enemy, knowing that the Americans were somewhere in the darkness, waiting. This was psychological warfare of the most primitive and effective kind. The Americans had learned to fight like hunters. They moved at night. They killed silently when they could. They used the terrain that the Germans had thought would protect them as cover for their own infiltration. Schmieger survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. The scattered airborne drops on June 6th had been considered a failure by American planners. The casualties were severe. Most units landed far from their objectives. The elaborate plans developed over months of preparation were worthless within minutes of the first jumps. But the Germans saw something different. They saw an enemy who turned disaster into advantage. The scattered drops had created confusion not just for the Americans but for the Germans as well. The defenders could not identify the main threat because there was no main threat. There were hundreds of small threats appearing everywhere simultaneously. German reserves that should have counterattacked the beaches were instead chasing phantom paratroopers through the Norman hedgerows. Units that should have reinforced the coastal defenses were fighting desperate skirmishes in their own rear areas. The entire German defensive scheme was disrupted not by a concentrated blow, but by 1,000 pinpricks that collectively bled the defense dry. By the end of June 6th, the American airborne divisions had suffered approximately 2,500 casualties. But they had accomplished something that no amount of planning could have guaranteed. They had paralyzed the German response at the most critical moment of the invasion. The days that followed, June 6th, brought even more intense fighting. The Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with thick vegetation, turned every field into a potential fortress. German defenders used these natural barriers to slow the American advance to a crawl. The paratroopers who had survived the initial drop now found themselves fighting a different kind of war. This was not the mobile warfare of airborne assault. This was grinding, brutal combat measured in yards rather than miles. The hedgerow fighting tested American soldiers in ways that nothing in their training had prepared them for. Visibility was measured in feet. Enemies could be hidden on the other side of a wall just meters away. Every advance required clearing fields one at a time, often at terrible cost. The German defenders fought with skill and determination. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of combat against the Soviets. They knew how to use terrain. They knew how to set ambushes. They knew how to exact a heavy price for every inch of ground. But the American paratroopers adapted. They developed new tactics for hedgerow fighting. They learned to work with tanks, using explosives to blast gaps in the earthen walls. They learned to coordinate artillery with infantry assaults. They learned to move at night, infiltrating German positions in the darkness. The German officers who faced them noted this adaptability with concern. The Americans they fought in late June were not the same soldiers who had landed on June 6th. They were harder, more experienced, more dangerous. The German army did not forget the lessons of Normandy. Neither did the American paratroopers. When Hitler launched his final offensive in the West in December 1944, the German attack drove a massive bulge into American lines in the Ardennes region of Belgium. German panzer divisions raced toward the critical crossroads town of Bastogne. The Americans rushed the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town. These were many of the same men who had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces surrounded the town. For the next week, the paratroopers held Bastogne against everything the Germans could throw at them. They fought in freezing temperatures with inadequate supplies of ammunition, food, and medical equipment. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from relief. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a flag of truce. They carried a surrender demand for the American commander. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, gave them a one-word response: nuts. The German officers were confused by this American slang. They asked for clarification. An American colonel explained. The general's answer is no. The Germans left. The bombardment resumed, and the paratroopers kept fighting. 4 days later, armored units from General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne. The Bulge was contained. The German offensive failed, and the 101st Airborne added another chapter to its legend. The Germans who survived the Battle of the Bulge would later describe the American paratroopers at Bastogne with the same mixture of frustration and respect that their predecessors had shown after Normandy. These were not men who followed rational military calculations. They were men who refused to quit regardless of the odds. The creation of American airborne forces had been controversial from the beginning. In 1940, the United States Army had no paratroopers. The concept of vertical envelopment, dropping soldiers behind enemy lines by parachute, had been developed by the Soviets in the 1930s. The Germans had used airborne forces to spectacular effect in their conquest of Norway, the Low Countries, and Crete. American military leaders watched these developments with interest but skepticism. Airborne operations were expensive. Training paratroopers required specialized equipment and extensive time. The casualty rates in combat jumps were frightening. Many senior officers questioned whether the benefits justified the costs. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, believed they did. He authorized the formation of a test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia, in June 1940. The platoon consisted of 50 volunteers from the 29th Infantry Regiment. On August 16, 1940, Lieutenant William Ryder became the first American officer to make an official military parachute jump. Private William King was the first enlisted man to jump. According to accounts from the time, King only became first because the soldier ahead of him in line refused to go. The parachute age of the American military had begun. What followed was one of the most intensive training programs in military history. Paratrooper candidates were pushed to their physical and psychological limits. They ran for miles every day. They practiced hand-to-hand combat. They learned to pack their own parachutes, knowing that a mistake could cost them their lives. The training took place at a brutal pace. Candidates completed a 3-week course that compressed months of normal infantry instruction into 21 days of constant physical and mental pressure. Every day began before dawn with runs that grew progressively longer. 5 miles became 10 miles. 10 miles became 20. The famous towers at Fort Benning, 250 feet tall, simulated the experience of a parachute descent. Men were lifted to the top, attached to a parachute harness, and dropped. The experience taught them to manage the opening shock and to land without breaking bones. Many candidates washed out. The physical requirements weeded out those who could not keep up with the relentless pace. The psychological demands eliminated those who could not overcome their fear of heights, of jumping, of the unknown. Those who remained developed an esprit de corps, unlike any other unit in the American military. They wore special boots. They received extra pay. They earned the silver wings of qualified paratroopers only after completing 5 successful jumps. The men who survived this training developed a sense of superiority that bordered on arrogance. They believed they were the best soldiers in the army. They looked down on regular infantry as legs, lesser beings who could not meet paratrooper standards. This pride served a purpose. Men who believed they were elite fought like elite soldiers. The training created not just physical capability but psychological confidence that would prove essential in combat. By June 1944, the American Airborne Force had grown from a 50-man test platoon to 5 full divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already seen combat in Sicily and Italy. They knew what awaited them in France. Many of them would not survive. They jumped anyway. The German military analyzed American paratrooper tactics extensively after Normandy. Intelligence officers compiled reports. Commanders discussed lessons learned. The Wehrmacht adapted its defenses to counter future airborne operations. But there was one element of American paratrooper effectiveness that the Germans could not replicate or counter. It was not a weapon or a tactic. It was a mindset. American military culture in World War II emphasized individual initiative in ways that German culture did not. American soldiers were expected to think for themselves when circumstances required it. They were trained to accomplish objectives, not simply to follow orders. This difference became critical in airborne operations, where the chaos of combat jumps routinely separated men from their leaders and units from their plans. German soldiers in similar circumstances often waited for orders that never came. American soldiers improvised. The German term for this quality was Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics. Ironically, German military theorists had pioneered this approach in the 19th century. But by World War II, the German army had become increasingly rigid and centralized under Hitler's control. The Americans, without knowing the German terminology, had adopted the German theory and carried it further than the Germans themselves. Friedrich von der Heydte survived the war. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge after leading a failed German paratrooper operation behind American lines. He later served in the West German Army during the Cold War and became a professor of political science. In 1948, while held at Allendorf prisoner of war camp, von der Heydte wrote a detailed account of his regiment's operations for the United States Army Historical Division. The document, known as Foreign Military Studies Manuscript B. 839, remains one of the most important German primary sources on the Normandy campaign. In this account, von der Heydte reflected on his experiences fighting American paratroopers. He gave them credit for their courage and their tactical flexibility. He acknowledged that they had surprised him. Not once, but repeatedly. Von der Heydte had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans. He had expected them to follow the same military logic that he followed, the same calculations of risk and reward, the same rational assessments of what was possible and what was foolish. The Americans refused to cooperate with his expectations. They attacked when they should have defended. They advanced when they should have retreated. They fought as individuals when their units fell apart, and they fought as units when their leaders fell. They would not quit. Von der Heydte was a thoughtful man. He spent considerable time after the war analyzing what he had experienced. He concluded that the American approach to warfare was fundamentally different from the European tradition. European armies, including his own, treated war as a science. There were principles to be followed, calculations to be made, rules to be observed. Victory went to the force that applied these principles most effectively. The Americans treated war as a problem to be solved. When one approach did not work, they tried another. When their leaders were killed, new leaders emerged. When their plans fell apart, they made new plans. They were practical in a way that seemed almost careless to professionally trained officers. But this practicality, this willingness to improvise, gave them an advantage that no amount of training or discipline could match. They were unpredictable. And unpredictability is a weapon in itself. Von der Heydte's post-war writings influenced a generation of German military thinkers. His analysis of American tactics was studied in military academies. His conclusion, that the Americans had won not through superior resources alone but through a superior mindset, challenged assumptions that had guided European military thinking for centuries. This stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat, this aggressive spirit that seemed almost irrational to German observers, was not something that could be taught in military academies. It came from somewhere deeper. Perhaps it came from the volunteer nature of the airborne forces. Every American paratrooper had chosen to be there. They had volunteered for the army, then volunteered again for the paratroopers, then volunteered a third time for combat. These were men who ran toward danger rather than away from it. Perhaps it came from American culture itself. The soldiers who jumped into Normandy had grown up during the Depression. They had learned resilience the hard way. They had developed an optimistic stubbornness that refused to accept limitations. Perhaps it simply came from the knowledge that they were fighting for something worth dying for. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions knew what the Nazis represented. They knew what would happen to Europe if Hitler won. They jumped into the darkness anyway. The German officers who wrote about American paratroopers after the war were trying to understand something that defied their categories. These were not the best equipped soldiers in the world. They were not always the best trained. They certainly were not the most numerous. But they were something that the German military had not encountered before. They were Americans. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit. They came from the hills of Appalachia and the streets of Brooklyn. They came from every background and every circumstance that a vast and diverse nation could produce. And when they jumped from those C-47 aircraft into the darkness over Normandy, they carried with them something that no German bullet could destroy. They carried the belief that they would win. That belief, that ferocious optimism in the face of impossible odds, was what the German officers sensed when they wrote their reports. It was what Schmiger felt when he trembled in his foxhole waiting for the Americans in the darkness. It was what von der Heide confronted at Carentan when his elite paratroopers were pushed back by men who had never seen combat before D-Day. The German word for it might be Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. The American word for it was simpler, guts. The legacy of the American paratroopers who fought in World War II extends far beyond their tactical achievements. The 82nd Airborne Division has remained on active duty from 1942 to the present day. It has deployed to every major American military engagement since Normandy. Its soldiers have jumped into combat in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The 101st Airborne Division transitioned to an air assault role in the 1970s. It remains one of the most deployed divisions in the American Army. The Screaming Eagle patch worn by soldiers at Utah Beach in 1944 is still worn by soldiers serving around the world today. More importantly, the paratroopers of World War II established a tradition of aggressive, flexible, mission-oriented warfare that continues to influence American military doctrine. The lessons learned at Brokaw Manor are still taught at West Point. The spirit that held Bastogne is still instilled in every soldier who earns the parachutist badge. The German officers who feared American paratroopers were right to do so. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were volunteers who had endured brutal training to earn the right to jump from aircraft into combat. They were men who had accepted that their missions would often require them to fight outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from support. They were men who believed in themselves and in each other. And that belief made them dangerous in ways that the German military machine could not predict or counter. When historians look back on the Normandy invasion, they often focus on the massive scale of the operation, the thousands of ships, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the elaborate deception plans and logistical preparations. These elements were crucial. Without them, the invasion could not have succeeded. But the invasion also succeeded because 13,000 young Americans jumped from aircraft in the middle of the night into a country they had never seen, to fight an enemy they had never faced, with no guarantee that they would survive until sunrise. The exact numbers were recorded. The 101st Airborne Division put 6,928 paratroopers into the air aboard 432 C-47 transport aircraft. The 82nd Airborne Division sent 6,420 men aboard 369 aircraft. Together, they constituted the largest airborne assault in history up to that point. By the end of June 6th, they had suffered approximately 2,499 casualties. 182 men of the 101st were confirmed killed. 156 men of the 82nd died. Hundreds more were wounded. Hundreds more were missing, their fates unknown. They jumped because they believed it was necessary. They fought because they refused to accept defeat. They won because they were exactly what the German officers feared most. They were American paratroopers. And on June 6, 1944, they changed the world. Decades after the war, veterans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began returning to Normandy. They came to visit the graves of their fallen comrades. They came to walk the ground where they had fought. They came to remember. The people of Normandy welcomed them. The French had not forgotten what the Americans had done. In towns like Sainte-Mère-Église and Carentan, streets were named after American soldiers. Monuments were erected. Every June, the American flag flew alongside the French tricolor. These aging veterans were treated as heroes. Children brought them flowers. Adults shook their hands. The French understood what had been sacrificed to liberate their country, but the veterans themselves often seemed uncomfortable with the word hero. When asked about their actions, they typically deflected the credit. They talked about the men they served with. They talked about the ones who did not come home. They rarely talked about their own courage. Dick Winters, who led the assault at Brecourt Manor, became perhaps the most famous paratrooper of the war after the publication of Stephen Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers, and the subsequent HBO series. People wrote to him. They asked for autographs. They called him a hero. Winters died in January 2011 at the age of 92. In one of his final interviews, he reflected on the title that others had given him. "I was not a hero," Winters said. "The real heroes were the men who did not come back." This modesty was characteristic of the generation that fought World War II. They did not see themselves as exceptional. They saw themselves as ordinary people who had been called to do an extraordinary job. Perhaps that was the source of their strength. They did not believe they were special. They simply believed they had to do what needed to be done. The German officers who faced them in Normandy might have been surprised to learn how the Americans viewed themselves. The paratroopers, who seemed so fearsome, so aggressive, so unstoppable, were often scared young men who kept moving forward because they did not know what else to do. The courage was real. But it was not the courage of men who felt no fear. It was the courage of men who felt fear and acted anyway. It was the courage of men who looked at impossible odds and decided to try. That kind of courage cannot be manufactured in training camps. It cannot be ordered by generals. It can only come from somewhere inside the men themselves. The Germans recognized it. They feared it. And ultimately, they were defeated by it. The last surviving American paratroopers who jumped on D-Day are now nearly all gone. The youngest of them would be approaching 100 years old today. Each year, fewer remain to tell their stories firsthand. This makes the historical record more important than ever. The diaries and letters, the after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the photographs and films that survived the war, these are now our primary connection to what happened in those Norman fields in June 1944. The German sources are particularly valuable because they offer a perspective that American accounts cannot provide. We know what the paratroopers thought they were doing. The German documents tell us what effect they actually had. Those documents are consistent. The American paratroopers terrified their opponents, not because they were perfect soldiers, but because they were relentless soldiers, not because they executed flawless operations, but because they kept fighting when flawless operations fell apart. The chaos of Normandy should have been a German victory. The scattered drops, the lost equipment, the broken communications, the dead officers, all of these factors should have allowed the Wehrmacht to defeat the airborne assault in detail before the beach landings could consolidate. Instead, the chaos became an American advantage. The very factors that should have defeated the paratroopers became the factors that paralyzed the German response. This transformation of weakness into strength is the central story of the American airborne experience in World War II. It happened not because of superior planning or equipment. It happened because of the men who jumped, They were farmers and factory workers, students and salesmen. They came from every state and every background. They shared nothing except a willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous mission in the American military. And when they landed in Normandy, when everything went wrong, when the plans fell apart and the darkness swallowed them, they found within themselves a capacity for improvisation and aggression that no training program could have predicted. The German officers who wrote about them after the war were trying to explain something that defied easy explanation. How did ordinary men become extraordinary soldiers? How did scattered groups become an effective fighting force? How did chaos become victory? The answers to these questions are not found in military manuals. They are found in the human spirit, in the determination that refuses to accept defeat, in the adaptability that finds solutions when problems seem insurmountable, in the courage that acts when acting seems impossible. These qualities are not uniquely American. They appear in soldiers of every nation in moments of crisis. But in June 1944, in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, American paratroopers demonstrated them with a consistency that their German opponents had never encountered. The result was a victory that changed the course of the war and the course of history. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we share a new video. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from Texas to Tasmania, from London to Lagos. Whether you are a veteran, a history student, or simply someone who believes these stories matter, you are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping the memory of these men alive.